Good evening and welcome. I am Professor Paul Kaufman, Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economics here at the University of Melbourne. First, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of the unceded land on which tonight's lecture is taking place. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we are privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. I extend my respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here tonight. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2024 Downing Lecture Series. A special welcome to members of the Business and Economics Advisory Board and the Alumni Council. Thank you for joining us tonight. It's been over 4 years since we've had the lecture in person, and the faculty is excited to finally have the opportunity to connect with you all again, and quite successfully so. Tonight's lecture is in honor of Professor Richard Evan Downing, the Ritchie Professor of Research in Economics at the University of Melbourne, from 1954 until his sudden death in 1975. In this position, Richard made significant contributions to economic research and did much to guide and foster the research interests of students and staff. He played a prominent role in founding the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research, who today co-hosts this lecture in conjunction with the Department of Economics. Richard Downing wrote about a wide range of economic topics, from theory to practical day-to-day matters. Much of his significant work, however, was in the area of social economics. His work at the International Labour Organization, his writing on wages policy in Australia, his writing on taxation with the emphasis on fairness, writing on housing, on poverty, and the provision of adequate pensions. The faculty is truly pleased to continue honoring Richard Downing's achievements through this lecture series promoting analysis and discussion of economic and social research policy. This evening's topic, where does wealth come from, is especially fitting. We are also honored to have members of the Downing family join us this evening. A very special welcome to Joe Norman, Felicity Pollack, and I'd especially like to acknowledge Richard's wife, Jean Downing. We are certainly privileged to have her join us tonight. Jean recently celebrated her 100th birthday. Thank you for your passion and for sharing Richard's deep commitment to supporting initiatives at the University of Melbourne. In particular, Jean has been an important supporter of social work at the university, and we thank her for her ongoing support, including her commitment to this lecture series. With the Downing family, we honor the memory of Professor Downing by gathering each year to hear from leading economists from around the world. I now invite Professor Abigail Payne, my colleague, Director, and Ronald Henderson, Chair at the Melbourne Institute for Applied Economic and Social Research, to formally introduce our distinguished speaker. Abigail.
Thank you, Paul. I, too, would like to pay my respects to all elders past, present, and emerging of the Wurundjeri people, as well as to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples here today. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speaker this evening, Professor Sandy Black. Sandy is a professor of economics at Columbia University in New York. She received her doctorate at Harvard University and her bachelor's from Berkeley. Her previous positions have included the University of Texas, the University of California, and the Federal Reserve Bank. She served as a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors and holds advisory roles with several organizations. Sandy has contributed significantly to research on labor economics and the economics of education. Her particular focus has been on the role of early life experiences on the long-run outcomes of children, as well as on issues on gender and discrimination. She has contributed greatly to the profession in several ways and includes her involvement as associate with the National Bureau of Economic Research, a member of various institutes that have focused on labor, poverty, and/or education, and she has served as editors of what we call A-star and A-double-star economic journals in Australia. She has also been a very well-liked and well-honored mentor and advisor to many a student. Okay, all that was on her CV. Now, so what she doesn't know what I'm going to say is I've known Sandy for quite some time, and what you may not know is a super important role that Sandy has played through her research that has focused on empirical studies of fundamental economics questions. When we were young professors, I'm a little bit older than Sandy, the common perception was that if you wanted to get published in top economics journals, you pretty much needed to work on US data. So those of us who were working in other countries faced an uphill challenge for getting published if we wanted to rely on data collection in the countries in which we worked. Early on in her career, actually just 3 years after receiving her PhD, Sandy started working with data from Norway. I'm sure at the time, Sandy, you were told this was not a wise move. Yet her first paper was published in what we consider the top economics journal, the American Economic Review. That first paper was instrumental in disentangling the causal relationship between parental and child educational attainment. Her research found that despite high positive correlations between parental and children's education, a child's level of education is less likely to be attributable to the educational attainment of her parents. Of Sandy's enormous list of publications, far more than 25% have involved her working with Norwegian data. Let me also note that more than half of her papers have been published in the very top journals, those A-double-star journals that we talk about. So Sandy has been a pioneer in not only producing important economic findings, but in the importance of making these findings utilizing data collected outside of the US. She has created the path that many of us have followed in our own research, and for that I thank you. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be available on our faculty website. Following the presentation, there will be an opportunity for your questions, which will be moderated by my colleague, Professor Philip McCallum, head of the Department of Economics. We approached Sandy to provide the Downing Lecture back in 2019. And then we went into lockdown. As a result, we have been looking forward to your visit and lecture for quite some time. So thank you for making the journey from the United States to be here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sandy Black.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been so wonderful being here and getting to meet so many wonderful economists and academics and everyone else. I've really enjoyed my time here in Melbourne. So I fear that some of you may be here thinking that I'm going to tell you how to get wealthy, and I am not. If I knew the answer to that, I wouldn't be here at all, probably. So as Abigail so eloquently said, what I've really focused my research on is how parents can influence their children and this transmission from parents to children. And so what we're going to be talking about today is the transmission of wealth across generations. But I want to start it with a little bit of motivation. This is probably not news to anyone who's attending this lecture, but there's been a lot of attention on the high and rising wealth inequality across many different countries. So to give you some statistics that you may already know, but I was less familiar with before I prepared this lecture, Australia has very high household wealth, which is great. The average household wealth in Australia is the 4th highest in the world, driven mainly by home ownership. But this distribution is unequal, and this is not unique to Australia, and in fact, Australia is quite typical. With the wealthiest 20% holding an average wealth of $3.2 million, which is 6 times the wealth of the middle 20% and 90 times the wealth of the lowest 20%. So there's substantial inequality in the country. And this is a graph that I borrowed from the OECD that shows, which was used in a report in Australia, that shows how Australia compares to other countries in terms of wealth concentration. And so if you look at the top blue bars, that's telling you how much wealth is held by the top 10% of the population. So if you took the 10% of the population who are the wealthiest, that light blue line tells you how much wealth they have. And so if you look in the United States, which is very, very far over, about 80% of the total wealth in the country is held by the top 10%. In Australia, it's more equal, so only about 50% of the wealth is held by the top 10%. And you can see the bottom 40%, so 40% of the population that's the poorest in terms of wealth, the fraction of wealth that they hold is negligible. That's that very dark blue. And in the United States, you can't even see that. That's how little wealth they have. And so there's substantial inequality in wealth across a whole bunch of countries. What's also troubling is that this inequality has been rising over time. And so this is from the Inequality in Australia report. I believe that was from the University of New South Wales. And what this shows is how much the average wealth has grown for each segment of the population. So if you look at the bottom, this is the people with the lowest wealth, the 20% of the population with the lowest wealth in Australia. Their wealth has grown by about 20% over a 20-year period, whereas at the highest 20%, it's grown by 82%. And what you have to remember is that they're also starting from very different bases, right? So the lowest wealth people have gained 20%, but they already didn't have very much, whereas the highest wealth people had a lot of wealth, and now it's almost doubled. So what we see is this inequality has been rising over time. Well, why is this troubling? If I told you that everyone was born equal, and if you worked hard, you were going to get wealthy, and some people worked harder and became the wealthiest, then you might say it's no problem, right? It's okay that there's all this inequality because it's really just, a choice that people are making. What's troubling is that we know there is a lot of persistence across generations. So if I am born to poor parents, I am more likely to be poor. And so we worry that there's something going on about opportunity, that people don't have opportunities, and that's what's driving this inequality. And so there we might be concerned as a society. And so what my research has really focused on is trying to understand what is driving this persistence across generations. Why is it that people born to poor parents have poorer outcomes? What is it that's driving that? And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you wanted to learn how to make money, this is definitely not going to do it. So I'm going to talk about first some research that I've done that's tried to disentangle the role of genes and what I call nature versus nurture or environment. So how much of this persistence of wealth across generations, the fact that if you have wealthy parents, you're more likely to be wealthy yourself, how much of that is because of genes, that I'm maybe smarter and or have more innate abilities, and how much of it is that my parents just provide me an environment that's better, that enables me to become wealthier. And so that's the nature versus nurture. After that, I'm going to talk a little bit about some other research, because what I'm going to find is that environment is very important and opportunities matter a lot. And so then the question is, what is it that's driving this relationship? What is it about the opportunities? And so economics has really tried to answer this by trying to look at what happens if you have a shock to your wealth. How does that affect your kids? So I'll talk a little bit about some other people's research that looks at that. And then I take a little bit of a step back, because wealth is kind of a funny animal in that it's a function of how much money you take in, but it's also a function of how much money you consume, right? So wealth is a bit of a choice that people are making, and so I want to talk a little bit about what we should be thinking about when we talk about wealth. So I'm going to motivate the first part with this famous conversation that never happened. F. Scott Fitzgerald said, "The rich are different than you and me." And Hemingway said, "Yes, they have more money." And this kind of, I think, typifies what we're thinking about with this nature versus nurture idea. So Fitzgerald is saying the rich are different than you and me, that there's some inherent difference about them that makes them kind of better able to make money and better, suited to getting wealthy. And Hemingway is saying, yes, they're basically the same as everyone else, they just got more money. They just had different opportunities, and so they have more money. And so I think that's exactly what I'm trying to disentangle, kind of who was right, Fitzgerald or Hemingway. And so as I said, we're trying to think about the difference between nature and nurture. So when I think about nature, it's really anything that happens before you're born. So you can think of things like, do I inherit skills? Like my parents are smart, and so I'm a smarter kid. It could be anything that's inherited. So we don't know kind of where your attitudes and your preferences come from. To the extent that they're inherited, that would be one of the things that we would be picking up. Nurture is kind of easier to think about because it's anything that happens in your environment. So anything your parents do by sending you to good schools, by reading to you, by moving to good neighborhoods, all those things would be part of environment. The hard thing, if you think about it, is that for most people, nature and nurture are coming from the same people, right? So your parents are giving you both the biology and the environment. So disentangling this is very difficult. And so what we do in our research is look at adoptees. And so the nice thing about adoptees is you're breaking the link between the nature and the nurture. So you have biological parents who give you the nature, and you have adopted parents who give you the environment. And we take advantage of this unique data in Sweden. So it was I had one project that was a foray moving from Norway to Sweden. And they would argue very different, but for the most part, quite similar. We're looking at adoptees in Sweden, where we can actually see who the biological parents are and who the adoptive parents are, and see who's influencing the child's wealth more. Is it the adoptive parents, which would mean that environment was more important, or is it the biological parents who would kind of are the ones giving them the nature? And so what we do in this project is look at administrative data from Sweden, where we have wealth information because they have had a wealth tax, so we had really good data on their wealth. And we look at children born between 1950 and 1970 when adoptions were only public. There were no private adoptions in Sweden at this time. And as a result, we have really good information on both their biological and the adoptive parents. And so just to give you an idea of the context that we're studying, at the time, as I said, private adoptions were illegal. The criteria for adoptions were kind of very traditional, so you had to be married, at least 25 years old, have appropriate housing, the father had to have a steady income, and the mother had to be able to stay home with the child, so very traditional. And so what you see is it's not random who's adopting kids, right? It has to be people who are a little more well-to-do, because you had to be able to afford to have the mother stay home. Additionally, children weren't randomly assigned to adoptive parents, and we might worry that wealthy adoptive parents might get kids coming from wealthier biological parents, right? And that would not be breaking the link. We need them to be unrelated, the biological parents and the adoptive parents. So we know that the children weren't randomly assigned, but they were assigned based on things that aren't related to their wealth. And that is whether they had, same eye color, same hair color, trying to match the children to the adoptive parents so they would try to fit into the family. And most children were put up for adoption very early and adopted within the first year. So one last bit of detail so that you understand kind of what we were doing. The reason we're able to do this is because Sweden has this amazing data, and that's kind of how I started working in Norway. They have this amazing data where you can kind of see the whole population. This is much more common now, but when I started this research a little while ago, in Norway, nobody had seen administrative data. I mean, obviously, lots of people had seen it, but no researchers were using it. And so it was really novel to have the whole population. So we have the whole population of Sweden, and we have this really good data on wealth. Wealth is actually very hard to measure traditionally, because if you ask people what their wealth is, they're not very good at reporting it. And some of it's because a lot of people don't actually know what their wealth is. So if I said, how much is your house worth? They wouldn't necessarily know. And some people just lie. And so, so the nice thing is that in Sweden during this time period that we're looking at, they had a wealth tax. So we could actually see the government had collected all this information. And the way it works is the financial institutions actually report to the Statistics Bureau how much each person has. So it's not self-reported. The financial institutions are reporting it. So it's actually incredibly good quality data on wealth. And that's actually unique. You don't see this kind of wealth data everywhere. The other nice thing that we have is that we can match this to the population where we can see all kinds of relationships. So we can see who your family is, who your children are, and importantly, they collected this information on adoptees, which is, again, a unique feature of the Swedish context. So we're looking at children born between 1950 and 1970. We're going to constrain it so that you have to have your parents alive in 1999. And the reason we do that is because we need to observe them in the wealth data. So if your parents had died before 1999, they weren't collecting wealth data before then, so we can't observe them. That isn't a problem for most kids because they're pretty young at this time, so most of them still had their parents alive. We also said you have to have at least one adoptive parent alive in 2006 when we measure the kids' wealth. And the reason we do that is because we want to take away inheritances. So basically, if you still have a parent alive, you're much less likely to have received inheritances. And so what we're measuring, this relationship between the parents' wealth and the children's wealth, is not picking up the fact that the kids are going to inherit the parents' wealth, because the parents are still alive. And so what we do is very simple, but it, of course, took us a long time to do it, is just estimate the relationship between the parents' wealth and the children's wealth. And so how do we do that? Well, the first, it's relatively straightforward. We first calculate what your wealth rank is. And so what we do is we basically take everyone who is your age and rank you based on your wealth, and then calculate where you are in the distribution. So people at the very top, who are the 99th percentile, have the highest wealth among people their age, and people at the bottom have the lowest wealth of people their age. But we're only comparing you to other people who are the same age as you. And so we do that for the children and the parents. And then we just see, are they moving together? What's the relationship? And so for biological parents, where you raise your own child, you raise your biological child, there's just one relationship. There's only one parent who is giving you both nature and nurture. And we see if you're, as the parents' wealth rank goes up, as the parents become wealthier, what does the children's wealth rank do? Okay, so are they related, and how related are they? For the adoptees, what we're going to do is say, how related are the children's wealth rank to the biological parent? And that's going to tell us the importance of nature. And then how related are the children's wealth rank to the adopted parent's wealth rank? And the importance of that is telling us environment. And so to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is for the children who are raised by their biological parent. So this has a sample of over 1 million children in it. So it's pretty precisely estimated. And what you can see is here's the wealth rank of the parent. So as it gets up, the parent is becoming wealthier. This is the wealth rank of the children. And what you see is that this is upward sloping. So that means as the parent is becoming wealthier, the parents are becoming wealthier, the children are also becoming wealthier. And this relationship is quite strong. So if the parent moves up 10 percentiles, the child moves up on average about 3.3 percentiles, which is actually a pretty large amount. And so we see there's a lot of persistence across generations, that where your parents are is really pretty closely related to where you're going to end up on average. And so this is kind of an important thing to document. What we see is that wealth is actually more persistent across generations than most other socioeconomic characteristics. So if you look at education or income, they also are persistent across generations, but the slope isn't quite as steep. So it's not as strong a relationship. When we look at adoptees, so here we're going to try to break down kind of what's going on. This is where we're looking at biological parents, and over there is where we're looking at adoptive parents. So my co-authors are very visual people, and so they said, oh, look, this is much flatter than that. It was a little less obvious to me from just looking at it. But if you see, for the biological parents, we're starting at a higher level, and we're kind of ending around the same place. So this line is steeper than this line. And you can see the slope of this is 0.13, so moving 10 percentile up of biological parents will, on average, the children move up about 1.3 percentile, so smaller, and here it's 2.3 percentile. And so what this is telling us is that nurture is much more important than nature here. It's almost twice as important in terms of increasing the wealth of children. And so this was actually a really striking finding because and I will show you a graph later on, but for things like education, what we saw is that biology is actually much more important than environment. And so when we do this for wealth, what we see is that environment is much more important. And interestingly, when we allow for inheritances, so this is kind of a weird way of phrasing this, so I apologize, but when we let your parents die in our sample, what we see is that if your parents have died, the effect of environment doubles. So it was already twice as big, and now it's doubled again. So there's a huge effect of environment when you allow inheritances to come in. And so this all suggests that while biology matters, it seems like for wealth in particular, environment is what dominates, is what's really important. So this idea that wealthy people are inherently different seems not to be true. In the paper that we worked on, we tried to get some evidence on what's going on, and then I'll talk a little bit about other research that, what we do is we try to figure out the potential mechanism. So what is it about environment that's so important? Like, what is it that parents do that is causing their kids to be more wealthy? And so there are a number of possible channels. One is that higher parents' education could increase their investment in children. So it's not really their wealth that matters, it's their education. And we know wealth and education are actually pretty highly correlated. So it could be that you have actually higher educated parents and they're investing in their kids' education, and that's what's doing it. It could be that higher earning parents are able to help their children in the labor market. So it's not really, again, wealth, it's income, parents' income that is also correlated with parents' wealth. It could be that wealth directly has an effect. So if my parents have more wealth, they can more easily afford to give me opportunities. They could, help me with the down payment on my house, for example. So the wealth itself is actually having an effect. It could be that parents are affecting children through their financial behavior. So it's interesting, they could either teach you about investing, right? And there's evidence that parents do teach their kids about investing, about savings and things like that. And so it could be that's what's going on. When we try to investigate it, we don't do a very good job of explaining what's going on. So it doesn't seem like what's driving this is parents' education or income. It seems like it's really something that's related to wealth, something about specifically wealth. The fact that the children end up with higher education and income when your parents have high wealth can explain about 10% of this effect, so really not very much for that. And I kind of had thought that children's income, it would be kind of working through that. Surprisingly to me, differential investment behavior is actually a reasonable component. So kids of parents who are wealthy hold different portfolios in terms of assets and stocks than kids from poorer households. But an offsetting factor is that they actually save less. And so if you have wealthy parents, you save less. Well, that makes sense if you think about it. It's not that the parents are teaching them to save more. They have this buffer, right? If I need money, I don't need to save it myself because I have my parents who can help me. And so that's actually working in the wrong way. And so altogether, we can explain more than 25% of this environmental component. And so at that point, we said, okay, we need more research to figure this out. And so then, so this all suggests that while biology matters, environment or opportunity matters much more. So I haven't said anything about the fact that we're using data from Sweden, which still does raise eyebrows that, why do we care about Sweden? Oddly, people care more about Sweden than Norway, but and I'm not quite sure why that is, but it seems like I get more pushback from Norway than Sweden. But one of the things that's interesting about this context is that here's a place where you would expect environment to be much less important, in that there's much more equality of opportunity just provided by the state. And so the fact that we see such a big role for environment in a context where it is relatively equal in terms of health insurance, in terms of education, suggests that in other countries and in different contexts, it would likely be even larger than we're seeing here. And so just to give you a bigger picture, this is to show you kind of where different outcomes come in. This is a different way of thinking about it. So this down here, we're looking at adoptees again, and this is the relationship between the biological parent and the child. And this up here is the relationship between the adoptive parent and the child. And each of these points are different outcomes that we're looking at. So the ones I've already told you about are the wealth rank up there, and then wealth with inheritance. And the way to look at this is this dotted line is the 45-degree line. And so this line is where they have equal influence. The biology and environment have equal influence. Things below that are things where biology matters more, and things above it are where environment matters more. And so you can see, as I alluded to before, schooling is actually more biological in terms of the relationship than it is environmental. These other things are income and earnings, which are much closer to equal. And then there are things like the savings rate and how much of your assets you hold in risky assets. So your portfolio decisions, which are also much more environment than nature, along with the wealth rank and the wealth with inheritances. And so what this suggests is that it's not just in general that environment matters more, because there are other outcomes where it doesn't. So it's something specific about wealth that seems particularly environmental. And so much of the recent research on the effects of wealth has really tried to pin down what's going on. And so what I wanted to just mention are a few studies that people have done to get at why this is happening. Like, how do we do this? Because this is something that economists kind of focus a lot on. And so what is it that is wealth that's affecting kids? Now, again, we have this same problem, which is that wealth is not randomly assigned. It would be nice if I could do an experiment and just give people wealth and then study how their kids do, and we could see how that works, but it probably wouldn't be ethical or affordable. So what economists have tried to do is look at environments where it kind of simulates giving someone a bunch of wealth or taking a bunch of wealth away. And so the idea that we call these natural experiments because they occur in nature, so to speak. They occur in our society, and we see what happens to the kids if you experience this shock. So I'm just going to talk about, I think, 2 papers or 3 papers that look at this and tell you what kind of shocks they look at, because I thought they were kind of interesting. There's a large literature in economic history trying to get at the effect of wealth. And one of the interesting papers, I think, looks at a wealth shock where they look at the abolition of slavery as the shock to wealth. And so basically they take families where they had about equal wealth in 1860 in the US, so before the Civil War, and then they look at them in 1870, after the Civil War and after slavery was abolished, and you see a large group of families lost their wealth. And so it was a big negative wealth shock to these families, and so what these researchers did is look up what happened to their kids. So the family experienced a big negative wealth shock, what happened? And the answer is basically nothing. So they still managed to come back and ended up doing quite well. They married very well. And so what they conclude is that it must have been that not the wealth per se that mattered, but really the social networks that the parents provided. And so as a result, because even though they experienced the negative wealth shock, the kids were still able to marry well and bounce back. More recently, what people have done is look at lotteries as a shock to wealth. So that's pretty good. It's a pretty good shock to wealth, and we didn't have to pay for it ourselves. Well, not directly. And so there have been a couple papers that look at wealth shocks induced by lotteries. The problem is that who plays the lottery is not random, right? You know, certainly in the United States, it is not a random act that everyone is doing. And so what people have done is look at people who were big winners versus little winners. Okay, we can't see people who are losers because they don't keep track of that. But what they do keep track of is if you win a little bit of money versus you win a lot of money. And so what we do is say, how do the children do if their parents are big winners versus little winners? And so that's been done in 2 different papers. One is in Sweden and one is in the US. And what they see is that when parents experience a big shock to wealth, the parents actually are more likely to get divorced. So I'm not going to speculate on that, but the kids do the same. So it doesn't seem to have a big effect on the kids when the parents win the lottery. And that's true in both the Swedish and the US context. And what they're really focusing on, especially in the US context, is whether it affects the likelihood that the child will go to college. Because in the US, we have very expensive colleges, and so you need money to attend for the most part. And there's not much evidence that it matters. This is in contrast with some other recent research that looks at housing markets, where they say, okay, another way that you get a shock to your wealth is if your house becomes very valuable. And so they looked at the housing boom in the United States and say, okay, if you have a big housing shock, do your kids do differently? Are they more likely to go to college because you have more wealth? And what they find is that there is evidence that this wealth matters. And so the literature right now is pretty inconclusive. And so that may be an unsatisfying answer, but so right now we still don't know kind of what the direct effect of wealth matters. Okay, and so the evidence seems to suggest that wealth is transmitted across generations, that it's a primarily environmental phenomenon, that it's really happening because parents are providing an environment that enables the kid to be wealthier, and that we need more work to understand kind of what's going on. What is it about wealth that matters? So the last thing I want to do for my last few minutes is take a step back, and it's a little bit kind of, this was how my research went, so I'm doing it to you. I'm making you go through my process. But so I presented this research at a number of universities about the adoptees. And someone said, well, but isn't wealth your choice? Like, I mean, everything is your choice, but you may not have as much control over your income. Your wealth is really a function both of your income and your decision to consume it, right? So if I buy lots of fancy things, my wealth is going to be lower, and so versus if I save a lot and don't buy anything, then my wealth is going to be higher. And do we really want to be thinking about wealth when we're trying to assess inequality? And so to give kind of the extreme scenario, you can imagine one household with very little labor income, so they're not working, but they get a big inheritance from their parents, and then they invest that, and they do really well. And at the same time, the family next door also has the same amount of wealth, but they got no inheritance. They just worked a lot and didn't consume very much and saved. And so if we looked at those two households, we would say they were equal, right? That there wasn't much inequality there because they have the same level of wealth, when in reality, the source of that wealth is very different and might impact our assessment, whether we think it's equal or not. Similarly, you can imagine the two households have the exact same sources of income, but one household buys lots of stuff. They love going out to dinner and taking their kids on fancy trips. The other household does none of that and just saves their money. And there, if we compared these two households, they look very unequal. And we might conclude from that the society was very unequal, even though they had the exact same opportunities. And so wealth is really not a great measure on that dimension, like in terms of measuring inequality. And so what when we thought about that more, after we'd already written that other paper, and I even talked to other researchers doing research on wealth, and I said, how do you think about this? That wealth is, especially when you have kids, right? You can spend your wealth on your kids, and then you'll have low wealth, but you might have, great kids or something. And so I said, it's just really messy. And they said, yeah, you kind of don't really worry about that too much. So, but we worried about it. And so some of my co-authors and I decided to just dig into what wealth is. Like, where is wealth coming from? Where are people getting their money from? And we wanted to get rid of that whole consumption part, because that was causing problems. And so what we did was use administrative data from Norway, so we're back to Norway again, where we actually have a lot more, because they still have a wealth tax. So, because once the wealth tax ends, which it did in Sweden, they stopped caring about your wealth so much, and so they don't measure it anymore. But in Norway, they still have a wealth tax, so we still get to look at all their wealth. And what we do is try to construct a measure of how much income you are taking in over your lifetime. And so what we do is look each year, because we have this big panel of data, and look at how much wealth you get, how much you take in, how much income you get from labor, how much your house appreciates in value, how much your stocks are earning, and add that up over time. And so we call this the lifetime resources measure. So it's kind of how much you're taking in over your whole lifetime. And we don't actually have your whole lifetime, so we do some tweaks with that, which I could talk about in lots and lots of detail, but I will skip that for now. And we say, okay, let's look at this actual measure of lifetime resources, because we think that's really what we're thinking about when we're thinking about wealth, is this kind of total resources available to you, absent consumption. And so when we do that, we will say, well, how does this measure compare to the measure of wealth that we're using? Are they very related? Because if consumption was counted a lot, they might not be that related. It could be that consumption is kind of changing where you are. So that's one thing that we do. Another thing we do is say, well, where are people getting their resources from? Where are they getting their money from? And does that vary depending on where you are in lots of distribution? So we focus primarily in the wealth distribution. So are wealthy people getting their money from different sources than less wealthy people? And not surprisingly, yes, they do get it from different sources. And so what we do is we calculate this lifetime resources measure and find that for people at the tails, so the very rich and the very poor, this lifetime resources measure is actually very close to your actual wealth. And that's because very rich people tend to stay people with lots of income coming in tend to stay very rich because you can only consume so much. And very poor people, or very low wealth people, tend to have very low sources of income. What we see in the middle is that there's not much relationship, because most people spend all their money. Like, most people don't have a lot of wealth. And so that was kind of interesting, and it suggests that for some people this is a good measure. For other people it's not necessarily. Like, if you're kind of in the middle, it's more picking up your consumption, these differences in wealth, than necessarily your differences in income. We also can look at where the money is coming from, and we see, as I said, that it's coming from different sources. We see most people get most of their money from working. That labor income, even at the top of the distribution, you see people making a substantial amount of their money as a fraction from working. However, at the very top, you also get a lot of money from your investments, whereas people in the middle just don't have that much money to invest. And so they're getting a lot mostly from labor income, but a little bit from their housing wealth. Okay, and then people at the bottom have very little wealth or income. So, but they're getting it almost entirely from labor and some government aid. One of the things that we found that we thought was surprising and people didn't believe, so we had to write a whole other paper about it, was that inheritances and gifts aren't that important for most people. They are important for some people. The very rich people get, the people with very rich parents get a large fraction of their money from inheritances, but the people with very rich parents aren't all the wealthy people. So there's lots of very wealthy people who get very little from inheritance. And inheritance is actually not very important in terms of where you're getting your money from. On average, it's about anywhere from 2 to 5%. Even among kind of the very wealthy, it goes up to 5% of your resources are coming from inheritance, which isn't very much, and certainly much less than I and others thought. And so because people didn't believe it, we had to write a whole other paper convincing them. But I'm going to assume for now that you believe it. And so to conclude, what hopefully I have convinced you at least, or at least got you thinking about, is that that wealth transmission is primarily driven by environment and the opportunities that kids have, which suggests that there's a real role for policy, because these are the things that we can easily, or maybe easily but expensively fix. And so in terms of trying to figure out, and there are a lot of researchers in this room doing work on this, kind of how we can fix these problems, what we can do to increase and improve the opportunities that kids have that lead them to do better and have more wealth in the long run. And then I just want to close with just this idea that wealth is a very messy measure, and so you should always think about that when people are talking about it. And so with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
So we still have 2 small things to do. First, just as a sort of a token of our appreciation for you coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is that also for me?
No, sorry about that.
I'm like, I get 2?
No, it's actually just to recognise the contribution of the Downer family and Jean Downer in particular for her continued support. Thank you very much. All right, so that concludes the Downing, or this version, this part of the Downing lecture sequence for this year. We will have another one coming up in April, so stay tuned. And thank you all for coming out tonight.